Well, hello everyone. It's fantastic to be back with you again. This is an opportunity for us to continue thinking about portraits using the Ashmolean as a starting point. Last time, if you remember, we looked at some quite traditional portraits, quite a few of them quite old-fashioned. And we looked at this portrait of Gianfrancesco Sagredo, and I'm hoping you also had the opportunity to watch a short film about this portrait on the Ashmolean's website. And what we're going to do is pick up on similar themes to the ones we looked at last time, thinking about faces, thinking about body language, the pose, the way that someone's standing or sitting, thinking about clothes, thinking about the objects in the paintings, also the setting. Are they in a room? Are they in a particular place? And also what's in the distant background. So those are themes that we're going to follow through today. We're going to look today at more recent portraits, and particularly because we looked at so many men last time, we're going to look at quite a few portraits of women. Obviously, the Ashmolean's collections are absolutely enormous, and I've only been able to pick a very small selection today. So what you could do is look online. If you search under Ashmolean collections online, you could just look up portraits and you'll see lots and lots more of different sorts of portraits. The other restriction we have today is that some of our most recent portraits in our modern art gallery are not out of copyright, so I can't use them in this talk, but that's a brilliant opportunity for you to do some research afterwards and look at the collections online. So let's get going. So I thought I would begin with this portrait by Edouard Manet from 1868. Now, Manet is one of the Impressionist painters from France. He's sometimes called the father of the Impressionists. And if you think back to those very traditional portraits we were looking at last time, they were quite stylized. The people were very formal, in very formal settings, either landscapes or rooms with very special objects around them. And what the Impressionists were trying to do was something quite different, to think about the movement of the weather, the movement of light. Often the paintings were made outdoors. Now, this painting was actually done in a studio, but it's a scene of a lady sitting on a balcony. It's a study. It's not quite finished. If you look at the railings, you can see they're not quite finished. And there is another painting in Paris called Le Balcon, which is almost like a zoomed out view of this painting with more people in it. You can see a woman on the right there, and that pointy brown thing we think is her parasol. So it's an unfinished work, but that tells us quite a lot about the way that Manet painted. So Fanny Claus was a friend of Manet's wife. She was quite an interesting woman. She was in the first all-female violin quartet in France. So this was an amazing thing. So she was probably a friend of the family. Maybe he asked her to pose as a friend. And he's imagining her looking out at a balcony. And when we look at her, we've got a domestic scene. We've got shutters in the background. We've got a piece of clothing draped on a stool, maybe some gloves on the floor. And then she does look like she's wearing her best clothes. There's a lot of shine and sheen in this fabric. Maybe it's silk. But what we have is something quite personal. She looks distant. She looks a little bit melancholy, a little bit sad. So it's a more personal view of a portrait, maybe just made as a painting of a friend, not for any great commission, but somebody who's interested in trying to capture a likeness. And the fact that Fanny Claus died quite young adds an extra layer of sort of melancholy to this picture. And if you're interested in finding out more, you can look on our website and see a curator talking about this painting. So we're going to jump through in time quite quickly. This one's actually going back a little bit. And this is an English painting. It's in our Pre-Raphaelite gallery in the museum. And what you'll see here is a totally different painting style to the Impressionists. We had those very rough, loose brushstrokes in the last painting. And in this painting, we've got incredibly, almost microscopically fine brushstrokes. And this is a painting of a nun. It's called Convent Thoughts. But what's interesting about this painting is the symbolism of all the different things in the picture. And I've included quite a lot of written information here you could look at more slowly. So the nun is looking at a passion flower, symbolizing the crucifixion of Christ. She's holding a religious book with an image of the Virgin Mary. And round the frame, which was designed by another pre-Raphaelite artist, it says, as the lily among the thorns in Latin. So the thorns are quite vicious, aggressive plants, and the lily, a very pure, gentle white plant from the Song of Solomon in the Bible. So this was traditionally also associated with the Virgin Mary, as was this setting of the enclosed garden. So there is a lot going on in this picture. It's almost like a symbolic painting of this nun. It's not just a simple portrait of a person. So the flowers all symbolize different aspects of what it's like to be a nun. We've got remembrance with the little blue forget-me-nots, purity with the big white Madonna lilies, constancy with the evergreen trumpet honeysuckle, and most of all, as we've already said, the Passion of Christ, which is his crucifixion, where she's holding this passion flower in her hand. So a portrait can contain messages. We looked at some of those things with Gianfrancesco, with the objects he had in the setting. And the objects in this painting, particularly the flowers, and the book contain all sorts of messages, and the setting of the garden, about the purity of this nun. And if you're interested to know, a few years ago, Gucci used a close-up of the water and the water lilies for an advertising campaign. What's interesting is how pictures can have different lives at different times and be interesting and used in different ways. Now we're going to look at a few paintings from about 100 years ago by this painter, Walter Sickert. It's a very, very different time again. We've looked at Impressionism, pre-Raphaelites, and now what we're doing is looking at the Camden Group. Now the Camden Group, we have a gallery at the Ashmolean called Sickert and the Camden Group. And the group worked in London, and they were interested in painting everyday life. And if you stood in the gallery, you would see that a lot of the colours, particularly Sickert's work, are dark browns, yellows, greens. They're quite everyday, downbeat colours. And what we have here is a portrait of Ethel Sands. Now, she was a friend of Sickert's, and she was also an artist. And we have some works of hers in our collection too. What's interesting at the time, 100 years ago, is that because women weren't accepted into circles in the way they are today, she wasn't actually allowed to join the Camden Group, even though she was an artist in her own right. She could only represent herself if she paid for a gallery space and had an exhibition. And this is not the most flattering portrait, but isn't it engaging? Look at the brightness of her eyes, the smile. I sense from looking at this the warmth of the friendship she has with Sickert. It's a very sort of lifelike, but also a personal reflection of how he sees Ethel Sands. She looks like she's sitting in maybe a chair with a leather studding, a lining, and wearing sort of maybe the clothes she would wear to be around the house. And it looks like almost a sitting room. So this is a personal portrait, but also it's got a sense of Ethel. And actually, if you look at the label in the gallery, what it says is he was trying to create a feeling of her, an atmosphere around her, a sort of emotional impression of what she was like. And we do get a sense of vibrancy, warmth. She was an incredibly dynamic and interesting person. She had lots of friends who were artists. She would get people together for creative conversations. She had a house in France. We think she had a female lover who was her permanent companion, and she set up field hospitals in France for soldiers and nurse soldiers during World War I, sorry, and also she worked in a factory, a munitions factory in Britain. So she was an incredibly interesting and unusual and vibrant woman, and that really comes through in this picture. Now, this is a self-portrait by Walter Sickert. We don't have many self-portraits in our collection, and it's a little bit confusing when you first look at it. But what we're looking at here is, imagine we're looking into the mirror, and this is a reflection in the mirror. Sickert is painting himself by looking at himself in the mirror. So these two items, the vase and the bust of Tom Sayers, who was a famous boxer, if you look carefully, you can see there's a sort of double version as they're reflected. But what's quite interesting about this, and he's very interested obviously in this character Tom Sayers and the boxing, is it's very hard to see the details in Sickert's face. And if you were in the gallery, you'd be able to see again, it's no clearer there. His facial expression is very obscured. There are loose brush strokes. It's almost like he's hiding from us a little bit. He's painted himself in his sitting room, but it's a very, very unusual self-portrait. The other thing to notice that's happened in between the first film and the one I'm just making now is that the camera has been invented. So whereas for the first set of portraits we looked at, there needed to be a lifelike representation, now we have cameras for that. So what artists can do is play with the way they present people to give more of a feeling about them, to give their own impression. They don't need to be an accurate likeness. Now what we have here is some other portraits from our collection. On the right hand side, there's another self-portrait. As we say, we don't have many. And this is, we're jumping back in time a bit here, but this is Samuel Palmer, who was an artist. We have some of his works in our collection. And I don't know about you, but this is a melancholy picture to me. There's almost a sadness in his eyes. He hasn't quite, if you look at the painting, it's not like we're making eye contact with him. He almost looks like he's looking slightly down. He's used black chalk and white chalk to create this picture. And we could think about what's his facial expression like? What clothes is he wearing? A sort of quite formal, quite expensive sort of silk tie maybe, and a formal jacket. But he looks very intriguing, very mysterious, slightly sad. So it's a very, very different impression he's giving of himself to the one we've just seen from Sickert. This is a very accurate likeness, but he's got a lot of emotion in the picture. Now, Farmer's Boy is actually 1894 on the left-hand side. And this, once again, is an informal painting compared to those grand portraits we saw before. We don't know exactly who this boy was, but somebody was interested to capture an everyday life scene for a young boy who's just working on the farm wearing his normal everyday clothes. And once again, a very different purpose to creating this, maybe to capture a sense of farming, normality, country life, not for any particular commissioned reason. This is not a famous person, this boy. It's just somebody who interested the artist and he wanted to take an impression of. So with both of these pictures, we don't have any particular clues in the background. The Farmer's Boy is a little bit of a sense of countryside, maybe with the greens and the reds. But with Samuel Palmer, it's just a very, very simple background and all of the attention is drawn to his face. Now we're moving on in time a little bit more. This is a painting by an artist called Gwen John, called The Convalescent. And this is a very, very simple impression of a person looking down. We know that Gwen John did a lot of painting in Paris, although she was English, or sorry, in France. And we know that she would often just paint children from her local village and ask them to sit for her. So it's quite likely this was a young girl from her village who she just asked to sit very still. We've got a teapot, an armchair, a cup, and this little girl looking at a book. She's probably a teenager. And once again, it's a domestic setting. It's not, we don't see her facial expression. It creates a very sort of a serene, calm mood. And the convalescent implies that maybe this is a girl who's been ill and is getting better steadily, rehabilitating herself, just sitting quietly in a very still way. So it's nice to be able to see a painting by a woman. We don't have a huge number of paintings by women in our collection. So it's wonderful to have this very gentle, everyday scene as a portrait. Now going back around the same time, we've got a drawing here by John Singer Sargent of a person who's naming themselves Vernon Lee here. Now this is actually a woman who at the time was experimenting with a man's name, Vernon Lee. She also had a name as a woman, and she would sometimes dress in quite mannish clothes and was an incredibly prolific painter and writer and incredibly talented woman at the time. And what's unusual and special about Vernon Lee is the way she was playing with ideas of masculinity and femininity at a time about 100 years ago when it was deeply unfashionable to do so. And so she's a very, very interesting character. And if you'd like to know more about her, you can listen to a podcast called Museum Secrets from the Ashmolean about her. She had a partner, female partner, and they actually invented the word empathy in relation to looking at art. What they invented was an idea that when you look at art, your body actually moves and responds in response to it. So John Singer Sargent was another artist, likely to have been a friend, who's made this informal, personal pencil sketch of Vernon Lee to create a sense of the person at the time. So this would be a very interesting person to find out more of. What we're looking at here is something much more recent, Miss Orovida Pizarro. Now, although this isn't a self-portrait, I'm quite reminded of Gianfrancesco Sagredo with this portrait because Orovida Pizarro commissioned it herself. She wants to be painted in her house in Redcliffe Square in London. She's got some beautiful, expensive antique furniture. This is a domestic setting once again. She's in her chintz armchair, and she was related to the Pizarro family. We have a lot of Pizarro works at the Ashmolean Museum. Pizarro was a French impressionist. And when she gave quite a lot of the archive, the paintings and books and collection from the Pizarro family to the museum, she wanted this painting to be made to accompany it. She was also an artist in her own right, and we also have some of her paintings in the museum. And we know from accounts at the time that she was an incredibly kind and generous and positive and warm person, which really comes through in this picture. She's very comfortable with herself. She's wearing strong, bold colours, and the objects that are around her, the china cat and the book on the table, the book refers to the Pizarro archive and is a catalogue of works in that archive, and the cat represents some interests of hers of collecting ceramics. So this is an interesting portrait that's by the person who's decided how they want to be shown in a picture. A little bit like you were thinking about when you took your selfie or your photograph. How do you want to be shown? What setting do you want to be in? What objects do you want to include? And how do you want to be presented to other people? So we've looked at a very few paintings, and what I'm going to suggest now is a few things you could do to follow up if you want to think more about. This is a downloadable, printable sheet that you can find on our website. And these are some of the kinds of questions you could use if you wanted to explore portraits for yourself. You could take this around a gallery with you, you could print it off, and you could look at different portraits online and just have fun, imaginatively engaging with some of the portraits that you find. You could think about the clothing, imagining what's happening beyond the frame. You could pick a portrait and choose a song to accompany it. That's a really fun thing to do. You could find a painting showing two or more people. We haven't done that today, but we've got plenty in our collections. There'll be plenty you can find online. And imagine the conversation they would be having. Imagine it was a film still and you press play. What would happen? You could think about the background. What can you find? Where would you go? Or you could look for a portrait that looks like somebody you know. Lots of interesting activities to engage creatively. So finally, what I suggest you could do is to think about portraits from about 1950 onwards, work that would be not out of copyright in our collections. The huge explosion in terms of different ranges, styles, materials, approaches, some very abstract works. Some would emphasize different aspects of a person. Some are very technically, you feel like you can see the person very clearly. Others give you an impression or idea of the person. So some ideas of people you could look up: Andy Warhol, Francis Bacon, Jenny Savile. They're just people, artists we've had exhibitions from at the Ashmolean in recent years. But once you start to look online, you'll find lots and lots of different artists. You could think about what different techniques they've used and what's the impact of those techniques. You could look at examples of photographic portraits. Think about what are good things and bad things. Maybe they're very accurate, but maybe you don't get such a sense of feeling as if a drawn painting is made. Which artist do you like most and why? And finally, what you could do is create and curate a little digital exhibition of portraits. Collect images that you like, put them together maybe on a Padlet board or online, and write your own gallery labels for them. Not copying what the museum does, but write them as if you could write anything you wanted. What do you want to point out about the painting? What appeals to you? What interests you? So that someone can see those pictures through your eyes. And finally, I just want to encourage you, keep creating and collecting your own portraits. You could use photographs, or you could just make simple sketches of people. So if you'd like to look up more, here are two web links to resources on the Ashmolean's website. I hope you've enjoyed today, and I hope you'll continue to keep on looking and enjoying and exploring different styles of portraits.